The night prior to our Best of Britain tour, Judy spent some time in our hotel room updating her diary. The following morning we were to start out for the city of Plymouth, passing through Salisbury, Stonehenge, and making a brief stop at the Cornish town of East Looe on the way.
Our Trafalgar tour guide on this trip was a very capable man by the name of Harry Gray.
We only had a very brief rooftop photo stop at the lookout over the city of Salisbury. Salisbury was founded in 1220 and is situated at the junction of the Avon, Nadder and Bourne rivers.
I zoomed in on the cathedral, most of which was built between 1220 and 1258, and is a fine example of the early English Gothic architecture. The cathedral spire is the tallest in England, being added between 1280 and 1310. We arrived at Stonehenge about mid-morning and were greeted by a rather bleak wind blowing across the open landscape. Stonehenge is Europe's most famous prehistoric monument and reputed to have been built in several stages. The circular ditch and bank around the perimeter, known as the Henge, is presumed to have been constructed about 3050 BC. The large stones in the circle are sarsen stones, brought from Marlborough Downs, 30 kilometres away, and there is little doubt the formation of the stones is connected with the movements of the sun and the seasons. The sarsen circle, built in a horseshoe shape, was erected around 1500 BC and consists of pairs of stones capped by lintels which were held in place by mortise and tenon joints. Moving further round the monument, we were able to zoom in onto the smaller circle of stones which was built around 2000 BC. These stones are known as blue stones and were quarried in South Wales. The circle was never completed. One can only speculate about the rituals that took place here, those thousands of years ago. The heel stone is to be found outside the avenue and is surrounded by its own circular ditch. Mounds of earth would seem to indicate burial grounds where these ancients buried their leaders. One final shot gives an overall presentation of this area with its surrounding ditch and bank. The sarsen stones and lintels in the circle are all that remain of this prehistoric monument that was in use thousands of years ago.
Leaving Stonehenge behind, we headed southwest on the M5 towards Cornwall and the little town of East Looe.
We transferred to the A38 and soon found ourselves crossing the Tamar River into the Cornish countryside.
We arrived at the small village of East Looe, stopping at the dockside where many small craft were moored, and across the river many interesting buildings stood out in stark contrast to the surrounding hillside.
David, our driver, was always on hand to help the passengers alight from the coach. We were to stay here for 45 minutes, so we hurried off to see as much as we could of this unique village and to explore the shops, making quick purchases of souvenirs.
The main shopping street was adjacent to the fishing jetty, and after passing a takeaway diner, a pharmacy and Barclays Bank, we headed away from the parking area and down this narrow street, which seemed to keep getting narrower the further we went. There was no room for cars to pass, except to drive in onto the sidewalk.
We passed the shop called Granny Pasties and saw the sign "Take away Cornish pasties" and were very tempted to try one. But unfortunately, food was not allowed to be consumed on the coach and we did not have time to sample one beforehand.
Like many seaport towns, seagulls made themselves quite at home. Soon we headed back to the pier on this cold windy day, ready to board the coach for our next destination, which was Plymouth.
We travelled back across the Cornish countryside once more, and again crossed the Tamar estuary, which marks the border between Cornwall and Devon. The suspension bridge was built in 1961. The river can be explored by boat from Plymouth. The estuary is quite wide here, and it took us some time to cross over to the Devon side of the bridge.
It was not long before we arrived at Plymouth, and after settling in, we took a shot of some of the city buildings from our hotel window. The red and white striped lighthouse is known as Smeaton's Tower and is based on a re-erected form of the Eddystone Lighthouse.
The following morning we were able to take a launch cruise on the Plymouth harbour. The weather was overcast and the wind was cold, but we braved the elements to photograph from the deck of the boat.
This old fort with its grey stone walls made quite an impressive sight as we sailed past.
Soon we were out in the Sound and heading for the mouth of the Tamar River. This flat landmass was on our left.
To the right was Smeaton's Tower, built on the Hoe, where Drake was reputed to have played bowls while waiting for the Spanish Armada.
Another shot to the right revealed many old stone buildings and a look at the fort from a different angle.
On our left we passed Drake's Island, on which a monastery stood in the 11th century. During the reign of Henry VIII, the monastery disappeared and the island was renamed St. Nicholas Island, after the patron saint of seafarers and fishermen. The island became an adventure island for children, but has since been closed for the last couple of years. It has now been sold to an entrepreneur who will be developing it in the future.
To the right again was Mill Bay, with its large grain silo, which has been left standing to protect the ferries from the prevailing westerly winds when berthing.
We were now entering the Tamar River, which extended upstream for a distance of 46 miles. We were told we would be travelling up it for a few miles to the naval dockyard.
This portion of the river, known as General's Point, was heavily fortified during the Second World War, and we could see a number of old gun and searchlight emplacements on the bank of the river.
We passed some old buildings dating back to the days of Nelson, which had had various uses over a period of time. They are no longer used, and the whole of the site has been handed back to the City and Territories Development. They are all listed buildings and they can't be pulled down, so the authorities need to find some future use for them.
We passed one of the many marinas in the area. This one had a group of luxury flats alongside.
On the green near this fine stone residence was a statue commemorating Robert Scott, Scott of the Antarctic, the first Englishman to visit the South Pole.
As we continued upstream, we passed many magnificent country homes.
We then entered the naval dock area. This section is the oldest part of the dock, and its history ended with the end of the Cold War. It is gradually being handed back to private enterprise.
The first naval ship we encountered was one of the Type 23 Duke class scout frigates, which are named after British dukes. We were informed they are a very sophisticated, state-of-the-art warship and able to see the Navy well into the 21st century.
We noticed a submarine berthed a little further along the dock.
At this point in our cruise, we turned round and headed back downstream, being advised by the skipper that complimentary tea and coffee was available in the saloon. Cruising back, we passed several more naval ships and many cranes, which seemed to indicate that these were very busy docks.
We believed these huge buildings to be dry docks, where ship maintenance and repairs can be carried out under sheltered conditions. The cranes here were of an enormous size, and we spotted a ship drawn up at the front of one of the buildings as we sailed by.
These huge car ferries transported vehicles between Devon and Cornwall. It would appear that this was the only method of transport across the Tamar at this end, other than travelling quite some considerable distance back to the road bridge, which we had passed over the previous day.
We then settled down to enjoy the rest of the cruise, and soon were back in Plymouth Harbour, and our morning cruise was fast coming to an end.
Our attention was directed to two flags, one British and one American, that marked the spot where the Pilgrim Fathers sailed from Plymouth in the ship Mayflower on September the 6th in 1620, with 100 or 102 passengers on board. A memorial has been erected between the flags, and the brick steps, known as the Mayflower Steps, are where the pilgrims boarded the ship.
A quick look at the local marina made us wonder how much money was tied up on this waterfront in pleasure craft.
It was now time to pack up the camera gear and disembark for our coach and leave Plymouth Harbour behind.
By now it was late in the morning, and comfortably settled in our coach, we set off through the streets of Plymouth, heading to our next destination. We had a front seat now, but the misty rain somewhat obscured a clear view through the front window of the coach. Plymouth suffered heavy bombing raids during World War II, and more than 80,000 houses and buildings were damaged or destroyed. We were told that the Allies had cracked the Germans' secret code before the raids, and knowing these raids were to happen, were put into a great dilemma as to whether to warn the city. We were some time winding through the streets of Plymouth before heading out into the countryside and onto the highway to Glastonbury.